Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be diving back into the original Gen 13 miniseries with Gen 13 number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in March of 1994, we see here on the cover all 4 of the team members that we met in the first issue are featured, along with the newest member of the team, one Rainmaker, who we will be meeting on the interior of this book. Co-creators, Jim Lee and Brandon Choi. Plot, Jim Lee and Brandon Choi. Pencils, J. Scott Campbell. Inks, Alex Garner. Dialogue, Jeff Mariotte. Letters, Ken Lopez. Colors, Joe Chiodo. Editor, Bill Kaplan. We can see here on the first page that the team is running through the middle of the Nevada desert late at night, being tracked down by keepers who are in crafts very similar to what we've seen in the past with the Black Razor assault teams. And they are joined by a new face that we have not seen up until this point. We see that they're all scrambling, running for their lives. Fairchild tells them to keep moving. They've got to keep going so they don't get cut off. When she turns around and realizes that it's too late, they've already been cut off, and doesn't know what the next move should be for them to try and get to safety. With the rundown here, we see that Fairchild is joined by Roxy Spalding, Grunge Chang, Sarah Rainmaker, Bobby Lane, and the new face that we're being introduced to, Tom Hallinan. Tom seems to be fed up with running as he turns around, and his eyes light up with a set of powers that seem somewhat familiar as we notice the ships that were following them start to veer off course. The crews inside the ships all grabbing their heads in agony, screaming in pain. As the ship starts to collapse to the ground, one of the agents inside states that his head feels like it's going to explode, and then suddenly it does. As the ship crashes to the ground in a huge fiery explosion, we see that Tom is pretty happy with his work and states that the crew of the ship got what they deserved because it was going to be them or him. As the team looks on in surprise and horror, Fairchild even making the statement, you killed them, and shock and surprise, Tom basically says that of course he did, that it's time to, start fighting for their freedom. And Bobby agrees as he states that it's kill or be killed as we see him flame on, as it were, because let's face it, he's essentially the Human Torch. He then takes off and meets the ships face to face as he starts to taunt them and tell them that, they have no business here and they don't look like they belong in this part of town. The soldiers aren't amused as they open fire with traditional, bullet firing guns and plasma rifles of some kind. This, however, has no effect on Bobby as he can generate a heat shield capable of protecting himself from such attacks as we see the plasma deflect off of it and the bullets melt in midair. And then Bobby tells them that he's done playing games and that they're going to find out why he was called Burnout in high school. Also, I'd like to point out that up until this panel right here, Bobby had been wearing blue jeans throughout the entirety of the first few pages. And this is a huge continuity error, as we will see why. You might think that maybe his jeans burned off when he, burst into flames. That's not the case. We're going to see later on in the book that this is just a mistake on the illustrator's part. Bobby unleashes heat beams directly from his eyes, which blow up 2 of the ships. One of them tries to get away. However, Fairchild grabs a boulder, lifts it above her head, and tosses it directly at the ship, making it explode. Even stating that despite the fact that the boulder was heavier than it looked, she still had no problem being able to pick it up and can feel herself getting stronger all the time, even more so than she was an hour ago, because this book actually picks up only 1 hour after the end of the events in issue number 1. However, she then realizes that they've lost track of another ship, which is landing not far from them, and is in search of the other members of the team who are hiding in a small cave under some rocks. Grunge is upset about the fact that he can't really do anything to help and that he should be doing something. However, Roxy points out that he is doing something, he's hiding. Unfortunately, they weren't hiding well enough to avoid being found by their pursuers, who, basically state that they need to give up. However, their sergeant in command tells them to stop screwing around and just use the gun to subdue them, as he then fires off a round known as the Tangler, which seems to have an effect similar to a bolo of some kind. This ensnares Roxy as she goes to the ground. Grunge is upset, as is Sarah, as she tells Roxy to remain calm, but things are looking bad for the three of them. Roxy screams out in pain as the lines begin to tighten around her as Grunge runs to her aid to try and untie her. He notices that the lines are super tangled up around her and it's going to take time to get her untied. Rainmaker states that she can give them some time and creates a huge burst of wind that creates effectively a sandstorm that knocks several of the soldiers out of commission, burying them under a heap of sand. This surprises Grunge as he states, "When did you get powers?" As Rainmaker replies that this was something she picked up back on the reservation, which would imply this is not part of something that she learned in Project Genesis and not part of her power manifestation, which is a little bit unique to her, that none of the other characters would have any kind of abilities before showing up, and she somehow does. However, she wasn't paying total attention to how many soldiers there were, as one of them gets the jump on her from behind and puts a pistol straight to the back of her head. The soldier states that while they are supposed to take them alive, the officer who gave that command is now buried under sand, and this soldier, aka Keeper, is really not too keen about risking their own life in trying to take these members of the group alive, and decides that she's going to off Rainmaker since she saw her use some sort of superpower. Sarah realizes that this is the end for her as she looks directly into the face mask of the soldier, and right as the soldier's about to pull the trigger, suddenly her arm is pushed up into the air as we see the shot go off a few inches away from Sarah's head. She then yells that, Sarah's doing something to her, which Sarah states she isn't, as the woman is then pushed up into the air, and Sarah is shocked to see what's going on in front of her. The soldier is then flung through the air and smacks against a large boulder, incapacitated, and Sarah turns around to realize that it was none other than Roxy who did that, as Roxy just smiles and says that she guessed her powers just manifested. Sarah states that it looked like the soldier was in free fall, which Grunge decides is going to be Roxy's new superhero name. He's also a little bit disappointed that his powers haven't manifested yet, but Roxy states that he doesn't need to worry, he's already super dense. The rest of the team then groups together with the three that were trying to evade capture, as they find one soldier who's unconscious and just lying alone. They decide to take him hostage and move away into the desert to try and avoid more soldiers. Fairchild, however, is not necessarily too keen on the idea of just leaving the injured soldiers behind, which is kind of odd given that she almost certainly killed several of them when she hurled that boulder into their ship and made it explode. It just seems odd that now she's all like, well, what do we do about the ones who were hurt? Well, what about the ones you killed? However, Tom states that, it's too late and he's not concerned about trying to save them, as they were all going to potentially capture or kill them as they were trying to escape. So Bobby grabs the soldier who was unconscious, puts him over his shoulders, and they begin to walk through the desert. Grunge complaining the whole time that he's cold and hungry and tired. Bobby doesn't want to hear it, as he's basically just telling Grunge to shut up. And then Tom yells at the two of them for arguing and states that they're going to make camp in a cave that he's found for the night. Grunge wants to start a fire. However, Roxy states that's a ridiculous idea, as it would immediately give away their location. And this is where they start to have a little bit of a conflict with the group, as they're trying to figure out what happened. And Tom states, I don't want to place any blame, but as he looks at Fairchild, however, is having none of it, as she uses her newfound abilities to slam Tom up against the wall, and states that this is in no way her fault and that she's still trying to wrap her own head around the events that are taking place. Fairchild then starts to recall the events that led to this point, noting about her recruitment from college and how she basically only said yes because she didn't want to have to spend the whole summer in Oregon, and that from the get-go things seemed a little off as they were given all sorts of testing and made to run through a bunch of physical courses and do all kinds of new physical training, and everything came to a head right at the end of last issue when Fairchild, Roxy, and Grunge were caught outside of their rooms in the middle of the night and attacked by a guard who was very threatening and violent to them, when Fairchild's powers suddenly manifested and she grew to be about a foot taller than she was, maybe more, and also acquired tons of newfound super strength. However, after taking out the first guard, his backup arrived, and the three of them realized that they had to get going as Grunge gave Fairchild his shirt so she could, not be totally naked running down the hallways. The keepers started to pursue Fairchild, noting that the girl at the front seemed to be really out for blood, and they didn't want to stick around to find out what was going to happen if they were caught. Fairchild immediately puts her newfound powers to good use as she rips a steel wall open with her bare hands, gaining access to all of the maintenance tunnels of the facility. The three of them make their way down one of the tunnels, believing that this is their way to salvation, when unfortunately they reach the end of the tunnel and realize that it is a sheer drop-off of hundreds of feet to the rocks below. Fairchild thinks that maybe she could survive the fall, but knows that Roxy and Grunge never could. However, before they can make a decision on what to do, their exit is cut off by the woman pursuing them along with all the other keepers. And things are looking a little rough for the group. But before we get into the story any further, we're going to be taking a look at a pinup by Richard Johnson. We see here that this is a pretty cool pinup featuring Grunge and Roxy sitting on what assumedly is some sort of, I don't know, maybe it's some sort of mechanized tank thing. We see Roxy has some kind of big sci-fi rifle thing. Grunge just kind of hanging out as she's balancing on his fingertip, which is kind of funny. I also like the fact that this pinup was put directly in the center of the book so that it could be removed and hung on your wall if you wanted to. It's kind of surprising when there are books that don't do that. It seems like it should just be an automatic go-to, that if you're going to put in this kind of a fold-out pinup, that it needs to be in the middle so you can take it out and hang it up if you like. We then see an advertisement for Savage Dragon number 8. I have not yet, at the time of recording this video, made it to issue number 8 of Savage Dragon. However, if you would like to learn more about Savage Dragon, feel free to check out my Savage Dragon playlist. Back in the maintenance tunnel, we see the ceiling of the tunnel starting to glow in a specific spot with a hissing sound, and then suddenly it burst open with a huge blast of heat engulfing one of the soldiers, presumably burning him alive, as we see that the hole was made by none other than Burnout, who, in this flashback, is not wearing the jeans that he was somehow wearing in the desert, and then somehow they disappeared. So as you can see, it's just a continuity error. And Rainmaker and Tom stating that Burnout did a great job and that now they need to make their exit, as Burnout is able to carry the rest of the group with a thermal updraft that he can control, which is a pretty cool use of his power. I've never seen that done with other characters who have this flame-based flight power, as we see that all of the keepers are smoldering. However, the woman in charge seems to be A-okay as she watches the group make their escape. However, as the gang is getting away and Fairchild turns around, she notices that the woman that was chasing them has a big smile and smirk on her face, almost as if she wanted them to escape. Bobby then lands further out in the desert, unable to carry the group any longer. Fairchild is then given a new outfit by Tom, which seems a little odd. However, Tom cuts her off at this point in the story and says that none of these things matter. All that matters is that he pulled them out of the fire and that all of them would be dead if he wasn't helping them, and that he figured out the Project Genesis scam long ago. He explains to the rest of the group that They are all the children of Gen 12 who all had experiments done on them by the government, and this has been going on for decades. And that they were all brought in because the government tracked them down and believes that they are all Gen active and is trying to get their powers to manifest. He states that unfortunately, many of the people that they've done this to in the past all went crazy and ended up killing themselves, and that he happened to manifest on his own outside of the project and then became a keeper to try and free the rest of the team. However, Fairchild thinks that his story sounds a little fishy, but she's kind of going along with it and states that they need to run and go to the authorities. However, the man that they took hostage has now awoken and states that there's no way they'll be able to run away, that no matter what, they will always be tracked down, and that they're too valuable to allow to be, or to allow to escape, and that there's no authority that's ever going to stop the keepers from tracking them down and bringing them back in. However, Tom seems to not be too worried about what the man's saying and says that it's time for him and the rest of the group to stand up to the keepers and to fight back, which Grunge states, yeah, fight back, that sounds good. And then Tom looks down on him and states that he's not going to let this man or any of the other keepers bring them back in and subject them to more of the experiments and testing. We then see Tom's eyes light up at a familiar pattern once again as the captured soldier grabs his head and starts to scream in pain and agony when suddenly his head explodes, leaving nothing but a blood splatter on the wall. Tom then turns around and states that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, and that it's time to go take the fight back to the keepers at the lab. And while most of the group seems to be okay with this idea, Fairchild is having none of it. She states that Tom enjoys killing too much and that she doesn't believe that this is the right way to handle things. He states that he doesn't care and that if he sees her again, he's going to assume that she's trying to stop him and that he'll be taking the fight to her as well. The rest of the group goes right along with Tom, despite having just watched him make a man's head explode with his mind and being really calm about that too. It's not like any of them saw him do this to the pilots and the crew of those two ships that he took down at the beginning of the book. This is their first time witnessing him making someone's head explode with his mind, and none of them seem really all that surprised by it. However, Grunge seems to have some reservations about following Tom as well, as he tells Roxy that he's not sure if they can trust him. Roxy states, though, that Grunge is being paranoid and that she has a kind of a way to tell if someone's good or not, and a little bit of a sixth sense, and that she can read people. Grunge is still not really buying it, though, and believes that maybe they should be listening to Fairchild's advice. However, Roxy states that Grunge isn't exactly all that bright himself and that perhaps he should just take her word for it. However, Grunge might be on the right track. Meanwhile, back at the Genesis labs, we see two familiar faces, namely Ivana, who we saw in issue 1 having a conversation with Lynch, and also Nicole, who is the one that was, of course, chasing Fairchild, Grunge, and Roxy through the tunnels. Of course, they had no idea who she was because they had never met her. As we see Ivana asking Nicole if her brother is going to come through, Nicole, of course, states that, there's nothing to worry about and that everything should be wrapping up very shortly. Ivana, however, isn't so sure, as she's wondering if Matt can be trusted, as he's been rather erratic lately, and she's not entirely certain about this whole plan of putting the youngsters into battle to see if their powers will manifest. However, Nicole states that Matt can be trusted and that he always comes through, even if he is a little bit weird at times, and then suddenly realizes that he's arrived back at the base through some sort of psychic connection that the two of them apparently share. She then states that to Ivana that he's here, and she confirms this on the monitors. noting them walking back in through the main entrance. She then states that one of them is not there, but that since the rest of the team did come back, everything seems like it should be okay, and tells Ivana to give the word for the trap to be sprung. Meanwhile, back in the main entrance, we see that Tom is leading the group through the hallways, stating that he knows which way to go, that the rest of them need to follow him. However, Grunge brings up that there's no guards at all, and this seems really weird. And this is when Tom states that Grunge is smarter than he gave him credit for, which isn't really that hard because he gave him basically no credit at all, as he suddenly transforms back into Matt, aka Threshold, who we saw in the first issue and is Nicole's brother. This surprises the gang as we see Matt then attack them with his powers and subdue all of them instantaneously. However, there's kind of a weird plot hole going on here. I'm not sure why Matt disguised himself and used an alias when it's not really clear whether or not he ever had face-to-face contact with any of these other group or with any of the group beforehand. Like, at no point did we see them have direct interaction with Matt in the first issue. So for him to have this disguise and the whole time really doesn't make sense in terms of the story, except for basically creating a ruse for the reader. However, it was pretty obvious early on that this is what was happening. I don't know, man. It just seems like a really weird plot point that wasn't totally necessary. After the team has been subdued by Matt's powers, we see Nicole approach and embrace him with some weirdly inappropriate body language and ask if the mission was a success. He states that they all manifested except for Grunge. She then asks where Fairchild is, and this is where Matt replies, stating that, she's strong but weak emotionally, and that he left her in the desert and she won't be a threat to them. Nicole seems to be okay with this and states that Matt did a good job, and then also brings up the whole, I wonder if you perform as well in other areas innuendo, which is gross. However, Matt tells her to just basically knock it off and states that this was easy because they really were like, children, and he was essentially just taking candy from a baby. Before Roxy loses consciousness, however, she realizes that she should have listened to Fairchild and states Fairchild's name as she suddenly blacks out. It is kind of strange, though, that Matt was cool just leaving Fairchild in the desert, considering that the whole point of Project Genesis is to take Gen active youth and make their powers manifest so that you can have superpowered beings that are in service to the government. And you had a superpowered being who has high levels of physical strength, and you just left her and aren't even worried about trying to bring her back in. I don't understand that whatsoever. Meanwhile, we see Fairchild awakening in the desert and realizing that the previous night was not a dream and that she is indeed a superpowered being now, stating that she's not sure where the nearest town is or where the closest women's big and tall store might be, noting though that she doesn't have any money to buy any clothes or any food and hasn't really felt this alone since the death of her parents, when suddenly her thoughts are interrupted when she grabs her head and is alerted to the peril of the others as she sees a vision of Roxy being essentially tortured in some way, hooked up to machines with her hands bound and electricity coursing through her body. She realizes that Roxy's in incredible pain. She also sees an image of Matt and Nicole basically, having a few glasses of champagne to celebrate, and states that, oh, that's that guy Tom. He was in disguise. It's like, but he looks nothing like he did as Tom. Like, you wouldn't know that this is Tom. This doesn't make any sense. We also see her starting to tear up as she's worried about her friends. So she decides that she's going to have to go to their rescue as we see her run back to the downed crafts and grab herself a weapon, as she believes she's going to need all the firepower she can get to take on all of the keepers, plus the superpowered beings that she may or may not be encountering when trying to rescue the others. And on the final page of the story, we see Fairchild locked and loaded as she grabs and holds up this ridiculous comic book gun that someone who knows nothing about guns drew, and state that the rest of the team needs to hang on. She's on her way, as we see that the story is to be continued. But seriously, this gun is ridiculous. It's pump action like a shotgun, but is magazine fed like a rifle. And I understand there are magazine fed shotguns, but even if that's the case, and that's what this is, it still doesn't technically make sense, as why is the barrel on the bottom, and why is there so much gun above it that's not doing anything, and why is there a laser sight thing on the very top of it like this? That doesn't make any sense. The whole gun is a mess. I'm sorry. It just kind of bothers me. I know I'm just nitpicking, but it really does bug me when comic book guns are completely nonsensical. We then really reach the sort of letter section at this point. These are just some letters that were printed up that were sent in after the first issue. In fact, most of these letters are essentially begging the creators of the comic to create a letter section and to have a contest for the naming of the letter section, which they agree to in their responses here, and is par for the course for basically every Image comic book of this time period. And that the winner is going to get, if I remember correctly, it's a Gen 13 #1 ash can that's signed by J. Scott Campbell, which actually would have been really cool to have. But, it's just kind of funny that, they weren't going to do a letter column at all until this many people were like, hey, what about the letter column? It just seems odd that, given that every single other one of their books had one, that they weren't going to put one in this. We then see a coupon that you are supposed to cut out and mail away to get the Gen 13 #0 ash can promotion. But they do state that they screwed up, and in the first issue, they printed the coupon on the back of one of the actual comics pages, and state that you can photocopy that one so you don't have to destroy your comic in order to be part of the contest, which I believe I brought up when I was doing my video on that first issue, that I thought it was strange that they would put that coupon on the back of one of the actual comic book pages and force you to mar the book to a point of being, completely destroyed, essentially, and just to enter a contest for a #0 ash can. But, to their credit, they noticed it too and did correct their mistake. We then see an advertisement for Gen 13 #3, which will be featuring Dale Keown's creation, Pit. If you'd like to know more about Pit, feel free to check out my Pit playlist. On the final page of the book, we see an advertisement for the Violator miniseries. If you would like to know more about the Violator miniseries, check out my Spawn miniseries playlist, where I have a video about each issue of the Violator miniseries. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Deathblow #5. I have not made it all the way to Deathblow #5 as of yet. However, if you would like to know more about Deathblow, you can check out my video on Darker Image #1 or my Deathblow playlist. And that was issue #2 of the original Gen 13 miniseries. Overall, I didn't think it was bad, but I also didn't think it was as good as the first issue. The first issue had a very well put together, easy to follow story that created a pretty compelling narrative, telling what it needed to tell and creating the right amount of intrigue to really kind of draw you in. Whereas I feel like this book kind of didn't know where it was going. The story felt jumbled in places. As I stated, there were some plot points that just seemed nonsensical. Overall, I felt like this book's story could have been written better than it was. However, I do feel like this book's story is still better and more competently written than what we saw in the original Wildcats miniseries. So we are at least seeing improvement in the stories that were coming from Wildstorm at this time. However, you might think there was nothing wrong with this story and that this book was perfect the way it was. And if that's this case, it's cool. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions, and that's fine. We can agree to disagree. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.